what we're going to be building today is this thing called plugin wrappers or skins, sometimes people call them. So we all obviously know that in Ableton Live, we have things like VST plugins. So this is one that everyone might be familiar with. The Polyverse Wider is a great free plugin. And plugins are great. They sound awesome. But at least for me personally, and I know for a lot of people as well, one of the problems with plugins, first of all, is they have this big old floating window that gets in front of everything that you're doing. So you're kind of constantly closing and opening things. And two, if you're like me and a little bit obsessed with how everything looks and having everything kind of neat and tidy, they all have their own kind of custom interfaces, which can be kind of cool. But what we're going to do today is we're going to design and build these wrappers that let you take VST and audio unit plugins and wrap them in a nice little Max for Live interface. So the plugin itself is still inside this, and all the audio processing gets handled by the plugin. So you don't have to do any kind of audio coding, which is kind of handy. So you get all the power of running the plugin, but you can build your own kind of custom interface for it that you can make look however you want. There's a number of other benefits that you get from creating a wrapper. One is that you can actually add additional functionality to certain plugins, and we'll see exactly what that looks like. And then the other is you can add sort of enhanced push compatibility. If you do have the Ableton push, you can set up control banks so that it just works a bit more smoothly with the push. Then I know you can obviously set things up like that with plugins, but it can be a bit clunky. So it's quite nice to have wrappers. Then the other sort of side benefit of building these wrappers is that it's a really kind of good way to get into Max, because we're not going to do too much heavy coding stuff, but you're going to learn the basics of how Max works and how you can sort of patch things together. So this is just some examples of the things that we're going to be building today. So we'll start off with this wider device. We're also going to build a wrapper. These Air Windows plugins, if anyone's familiar with them, these are actually great candidates for wrappers because they don't even have an interface. So you can give them a nice kind of cool custom interface. And we're going to add some custom functionality to that. And then we'll also talk a bit about just kind of general design principles for building wrappers, and some thoughts that I have on how to approach the sort of layout and design to work really well in Ableton's kind of device view here, because ultimately that's what we're doing, is we're making these plugins just sort of work nicely within the Ableton framework. So to start out, we're going to head to the Max for Live category over on the left here. Now, if this is your first time building Max for Live devices, generally whenever you're building a Max device, you go to this Max for Live category and we choose from either audio effects, instruments, or MIDI effects. Something that's worth mentioning at this stage about wrappers is, in theory, you can wrap any plugin, audio effect, instrument. There's not a lot of MIDI VSTs, so it's usually going to be an audio effect and instrument. In my experience, though, instruments tend to have a lot, or things like synths tend to have a lot more controls and very custom interfaces that can be a bit difficult to wrap, just because there's a lot going on there that you want to try and condense into a small interface. Also, wrappers have kind of a limitation in that if there are sort of too many parameters for a plugin when you start wrapping it, it can become a bit slow and clunky. So generally, the best kinds of candidates for wrappers are going to be like relatively simple audio effects, things like kind of analog modeled effects or compressors, reverbs that have a limited sort of set of controls that you can fit into a nice kind of small interface. So you can build instruments. We're going to be mostly focusing on audio effects today. So in order to create a new Max effect, we just drag in this blank Max audio effect to our channel, and that loads up this thing that looks like this. And any Max device in Live, you click on this icon over here to open up the Max editor. I'll double click on the title bar to expand that. So this is the Max editor. This is the first thing that you see when you open Max. And I'm going to skip over a lot of kind of very basic stuff. If you haven't already, there is a guide that I've created on some absolute basics for Max, which I'd recommend going through. But a lot of this will kind of make sense even if you haven't covered those basics. But I'm not going to get like super, super basic, but I will cover some sort of essential stuff that we need to know. So the first thing we have here is just the input and output of our Max device. As you may know, in Max, we have objects, and objects are connected together with patch cords. So the plug-in has a left input and a right input connected to the right output, left, right, and left outputs of our plug out. We also have these comments that we can delete. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to actually load in our plugin into Max to do all our processing. And there's a number of different ways that you can do that in Max, but the easiest way is to actually just head over to the plugin sidebar over on the left here in Max. And probably worth mentioning at this point that a sort of very important first step actually before all of this is to obviously make sure that the plugin is installed and make sure that it's showing up in Ableton. There's some kind of finer details we can chat about in terms of like plugins and custom locations that we can maybe chat about more at the end. But as long as a plugin is installed and showing up in Ableton, it should show up in Max as well under this window. Now we can work with either audio unit plugins if you're on a Mac, VST3 or VST plugins. I'm just going to work with VST3 today. The process is mostly the same, no matter which one you're going to be using. If you're building wrappers for yourself, you're probably just going to be sticking with one of them. If you're building wrappers that you ultimately want to share with people, you might be building them in all those different formats so that people can access them in those different formats. But we're just going to start with the VST3 plugin. And you can just find the plugin that you want from this list. So you can see I've got all the plugins that I have installed here. I'm going to find wider and just drag and drop that straight into there. And that loads up this object. I can expand that. And now this will have more or less parameters depending on the parameters that are available to this particular plugin. We've got a couple sort of tools at the top of the plugin here. We can actually edit what parameters are visible. If we lock our patch, so in Max, you have to lock the patch to interact with it. You can click on this little pencil and hide certain controls that you might not actually need. So for example, this bypass and this power control, we don't need those because we can just turn the device on and off using the on-off switch in Ableton. So we can actually just hide those for now. You'll see when I click the edit, now I just see the controls that I actually want to work with. And this is just going to make things a bit easier for me. Press Command E to unlock the patch so I can sort of start editing it again. You can click this spanner to see the plugin window, which can obviously just be useful to make sure that things are working as you sort of build up your patch. Now, a very important area in Max is the inspector over on the right-hand side here, this eye. So any object that you have selected in Max, if you click on the eye, it's going to open up the inspector that's going to show you various different options or parameters for that particular object. And so there's a couple different options available for this particular object that we'll kind of look at as they come up. The other thing that you'll find in here is the reference. Now, anytime you're learning new objects in Max, there's a number of different ways to learn how to interact with that particular object and the things that you can do to that object. One of the most sort of useful ways is this thing called the reference, because this reference shows you the kinds of messages and the kinds of signals that you can send to a particular object. Another thing that you can do is you can right-click on this, on any object in Max, and you can open a help patcher. And this is going to give you an interactive Max patch with a bunch of information about this particular object. So you can go in here and learn about different ways that you might use particular objects. So for example, if you want to build a MIDI instrument, this is how you might set that up. How do parameters work, etc. We're obviously going to cover all of that, but there's a lot of stuff that we're not going to cover about how this VST object in Max works. So you can go in and learn more about that over here with these help files. But let's just build up this patch, and we'll go through all of that as we get to it. First thing we need to do is actually wire up our audio. So every object in Max has inlets at the top or inputs at the top. And you can see if I hover over these for the plugin or the VST object, it says audio input 2, audio input, and control input. So all we need to do is we grab our patch cables here and hook that into the ins and outs of the plugin. Move that over here. And then at the bottom of the plugin, we've got a number of, we've got more than 2 outlets, but if we hover over these, you can see this is audio output 1, so we'll hook that up there. Audio output 2, hook that up there. We've got all these other outlets that we're going to use for different things as we kind of need them. So again, if you're totally new to Max, basically all we're doing in Max is you have various different objects that do different things. So we've seen the plug in, plug out is like your input and output, and you're patching those objects together just using these patch cables, connecting the outlets of one object to the inlets of another object. Usually you're doing a bunch of audio processing with various objects, but because we're using a plugin to do all of that, that just lives over here. Now, if we were to play some audio through this and adjust this plugin, everything would work now. The audio is running through this plugin. I can lock this patch and adjust these controls to adjust things in the plugin. But we obviously want to build some kind of custom interface using native live controls. So if I press the N key, I can start creating a new object, and I'm going to type live.dial. So again, just for the beginners here, when I hit N to create a new object, if I start typing in the name of an object, and you just learn these objects the more time you spend with Max. So if I start typing live, Max has this autocomplete. I can use the arrow keys to kind of move through things. But Max will show me various different options that I can choose from, different kinds of objects that I can create. So for example, I could create a slider if I wanted to. And so you learn these as you go along. But for now, we're going to just work with a dial. Now, the way we need to hook this into this VST object is this object needs to understand what is this dial actually going to be controlling. I could hook this dial up into the object here, but it doesn't know which parameter it's meant to be controlling. So there's a way that we need to configure this. And again, this is one of those things that you can find if you go into the help file. You'll be able to see exactly how this is all set up. But essentially what we need to do is we need to tell this object which parameter we want to control. And to do that, we're going to use an object called prepend. So Max has this object called prepend that adds a message in front of an input. So I'm just going to type prepend test. You put a space and then test, just to show you how this works. If I hook up my live dial to the prepend, I'm going to create a message box, which is the M key. Message boxes in Max are really useful for just kind of viewing things. You use them for other things, but one of the things you can do with message boxes is if you plug something into its rightmost inlet, it will kind of monitor that signal. If I press Command E to lock my patch and I move this dial now, notice how I'm getting the message test and then a number out of that dial, which is obviously the number of the dial. Whereas if I just connected the dial directly to that, I'm just going to get the number. So this prepend object adds a message before a message that we might be sending. So the messages that we want to send to the VST plugin, or the messages it accepts, there's actually two ways to do this. The first way is to use just the number of the parameter that you want to control. So if I just attach the number 1, and now I move this dial, you can see it's controlling. I'm going to explain why it's jumping from minimum to maximum in a second, but you can see it's now controlling that amount control. The other way you can do this, and this is the recommended way, is to actually use the name of the control itself. So if I just type amount, you'll see it's going to do the same thing. The reason for this is because if you want to build wrappers for different plugin formats, if I were to load up the same plugin, I go to audio units and load up the audio unit version of Wider. Generally, what you'll notice is that the names of the parameters are the same in different versions of plugins, but their order tends to change. So here, amount is parameter number 1. Here, it happens to be number 4. Low bypass is 3. There, it's 2. So if I'd used numbers for this, when I ultimately want to go in and switch this out for, say, the audio unit plugin, if I want to be distributing this, my messages are going to be all garbled. Whereas if I'd used the actual name of the parameter, then it doesn't matter what order they're in. Max is always going to pick up what I want to adjust. So generally, I recommend using the name of the control when you send it in there. Now, the other thing that's happening is you'll notice that it's jumping from the minimum to the maximum. The reason for this is because the VST object expects numbers in the range of 0 to 1. Our control, if we look at it, is going from 0 to 127. So let's actually configure this control before we go any further. If I look at the parameter I want to control here, I can see it goes from 0 to 200%. So controls in Max, if I click on them and go over to the inspector, You want to make sure you've got this all Windows option selected. You'll see I've got different kind of views here. If you're on all, you're going to see all the available parameters. And if you scroll down to the bottom, there's a section here that says parameter. And this is where we can do things like name the control, give it a range, set the kind of unit type that it's going to display. So always a good idea to sort of set those up initially. And so this is going to be our amount control. So the scripting name is something you can mostly ignore. It gets used in some advanced situations, but I just out of habit like to put a name in there. The long name is the name that's going to show up in automation in Ableton. So when you're adjusting automation for a particular parameter, so sometimes that's going to be something like low bypass, we might include in the long name, but the short name is what's going to show up on the control itself. So maybe you want that to be amount, maybe you want it to be AMT, for example. So you can have different names in either of those fields if you want something to display differently on the control. So if it's a particularly long name, then you can shorten it for the short name. The range is the range of numbers we're going to get out of the control. So we know it was 0 to 200 for the percentage. And if we go all the way down, we can skip over a bunch of these. The unit style is essentially what displays after the unit. If it's just going to be integers, it just shows sort of round numbers. We can have things like time, milliseconds. We want percent. Now you should see that I've got this amount control, which goes from 0 to 200%. So that's pretty cool. The problem here now, though, is that this wants to accept numbers from 0 to 1. There's a number of ways that we could deal with this. Max has an object called scale. So if I just type in scale, you can see scale says map values to an output range. And the way scale works is, so we hit space. When you hit space after entering an object in Max, you get this thing called arguments. Arguments are almost like sort of preset settings for an object, things that you can type in to have it automatically configure its defaults. And so you can see with the scale object, we have 5 different arguments that we can use. What is the low input value and the high input value? And then what do we want to be the low output value and the high output value? So for example, in this case, the low value we have is 0 and the high value is 200, but we want it to be in the range of 0 to 1. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put full stops after these numbers. The reason for this is in Max, we have 2 different kinds of numbers we can work with. You have what are known as integers, which are just whole round numbers, 1, 2, 3, etc. And then you have what are known as floating point numbers, 1.3, 7.26. A lot of times when we're working in Max, you're going to work in floating point numbers as opposed to integers. And particularly with these VST plugins, because it wants numbers in the range of 0 to 1, you need to obviously be able to have numbers in between that, 0.3, etc. So we want to work with floating point numbers. So we add these points there to tell Max, hey, we want to actually output floating point values from this device. Now, what I can do is I can patch this. I want to put it before the prepend because I want to scale the value before it goes into this prepend. And I can hook that in to the first inlet, which you can see as the number to be scaled, and then into that. And now what Max should do for me automatically, you can see is it scales that range from 0 to 200 to 0 to 1. So we should see that maps pretty nicely. Obviously, we've got extra percentage there, but that's fine, to the control that we have. So that's kind of one way to do it. And I wanted to show you that way because it's useful to be aware of the scale object in Max. It's a very useful object in other situations. But actually, there's a much easier way to do this with wrappers in particular. But delete the scale object. So what you'll notice is that most of these controls that we're going to use actually have 2 outlets. On the left, we have what's called the parameter value, and that's the actual value that the parameter has. So from 0 to 200 on the actual control. Out of the right outlet, you have the parameter raw value, and that says from 0 to 1. And what's really useful about this is no matter what I actually set the values on this control to be, this raw parameter value is always in the range of 0 to 1. So that's super handy for building with this VST object because all of its controls always want values in the range of 0 to 1. So I can just actually connect this directly to that prepend amount. Now, even though my control is showing that full range, which is going out its right inlet, it's just sending 0 to 1 to this device here. And that should now be working. We'll test this with audio in a second. So everything we've just done here, that's basically it. That is all you need to build plugin wrappers. Obviously, we've done this for kind of one control. We're going to do this for additional controls now. But in terms of the kind of complexity of the code and the things that you're going to be building, for the most part, all you're going to be doing is loading up this VST object with whatever VST plugin you want, adding these prepend controls for the different values. In fact, let's just do that now. I can hold Alt to copy that. And I'm going to say prepend low bypass and prepend mono. These all get hooked into that same, they all go into the same inlet over here. And then I just need to hook up some control to these. And that's all I need to do to actually have a functional wrapper. So let's add these additional controls. Let's go low bypass. So if I press Command E to lock this patch and I just check what sort of range I'm expecting on this control, you can see it goes from off to 20,000 hertz. So I can create a new live.dial. I can just go straight away and hook that raw value in there. And then let's go back over here. We're going to call this, I'm actually just going to call it high pass instead of low bypass. Oops, I can't spell today. High pass. And then maybe for the short name, I'll put HPF, high pass filter. And that's going to be 0 to 20,000. And we're going to set the unit style to be hertz. Another important parameter you might want to set for some of these is initial value. That's the value that it's going to load up with by default. So we might want to just go and set that up for our amount control here. And now look at that. It's controlling our VST plugin. We've run into our first little hiccup though, is if you take a look at this HPF control that I have here, at the value that it's sending and the value that's actually being set by the plugin itself, we have vastly different values here. So this is where we start to get into some more complex patching. So in a lot of plugins, it's going to be as simple as just adding these prepend and adding some controls. But sometimes we're going to get into some kind of more complex things, and we're going to look at different times where you might run into some complexity. Particularly around frequency controls, if you're working with something like a filter or an EQ, or in this case, we've got a high pass filter, frequency works in an exponential way. It doesn't work in a linear way. And if you have done any kind of looking into how an EQ works, you would have noticed that the way that the values scale is sort of 0 to 100 is quite a wide range, and then 100 to 1,000, even though there's a lot more numbers in there, it kind of occupies almost the same amount of range on the EQ. Because those frequencies are scaling logarithmically. And generally, this is because in the lower sort of frequencies, you want a lot more kind of definition. As you get up to those higher frequencies, you need a lot less resolution. It's just the way that frequency kind of works. So what you find is often with these frequency controls, they scale in an exponential way. So in Max, if I select a control and go to the parameters again, I can actually set an exponent for the control. So now, if I set this to say, let's say 3.33 is kind of generally a good guess for frequency controls, what you'll notice is it's actually much closer than it was before. 180, we're kind of more in the ballpark. It's not like completely off. What we can actually do is we can select this control, and you can just adjust that exponent value in real time. You can see I'm changing that. And notice how the value that's displayed on the control updates to reflect that. So if I kind of scale this up until I get pretty close to where I am on this control, 224, 228, so maybe that's going to be like 334, actually the other direction, 332, 4.32, we're getting closer, 4.31, you get the idea. We're now much closer to that value. But you'll notice that it's still not exactly the same. A lot of the times, just by adjusting this exponent, you can get to whatever exponent the plugin developer happened to use for that control. Sometimes, though, there's something kind of custom going on. They might have a custom curve that they've coded into this plugin that affects the way that this particular control works. And we're not actually going to be able to get that to work with this exponent value. So let's just instead set this to sort of something generic. I'm going to set it to 3.33 for now. And what we can actually do is another option here is we want to be able to adjust this control, but we want to have an idea of what this actual value is here. We can start to take some information out of this plugin. So again, we have all these other outlets that you would have seen along the bottom here. And the one that we're actually concerned with is this outlet over here, this parameter index and value when changed. If I press M to create a message box and I hook up the plugin to that sort of outlet to this right input of the message box, and I adjust this control, what you'll notice is when I adjust these controls, notice I get a number and then the value of that control. So 2 is for the low bypass, 1 is for the amount control. There's actually a setting that we can set within the plugin. So if I select this object and I go to this behavior section over here, parameter value output format, there's 2 options. Well, there's 3 options that we can have. The third is just a combination. We can either have value or we can have string. So at the moment we're in value where we get a parameter number and then the value of the parameter. If I set it to string, instead what we get is we actually get the kind of raw text value of that output. So you can see that it's still sending the parameter value 2, but it's sending the kind of number of that control. So we could use this to actually set our display on this control accordingly, so that we can see what the actual value that we're setting is. So first thing, let's click on this control here. And if I scroll all the way up to the top, this section where we have appearance, we're going to come back to that in a moment. But we can actually turn off displaying the parameter value for a control. So display parameter value, we can turn that off. So we're not concerned with what the value of that control is actually going to be. We just want to see what the actual output control of the VST plugin is, which we can grab from here. In order to display that, we can use something called a live.comment. So live.comment is an explanatory note or label. Usually this is where you might just type in some text that you can attach to or in your interface to label things. But in this case, we actually want to have this set dynamically by the value coming from here. So if we, again, use our prepend object, we can prepend a particular message to this called set. So if I were to click on this comment object and I go to the reference, I can see the kinds of messages that I can send to this object and what they might do. And you can see I have this message that says set displays a message. So if I send the word set followed by any message, we'll set the comment object to display that message. So in order to add the word set in front of this message, because I want to say set and then whatever that value is, I can do prepend set. And if you remember, again, if we just look in our message box, now it's added set to the beginning of that. So if I attach this to this text box, hey, look at that. We've got the number displayed on there. Now we've actually got the number and the value. We don't want that number over there. Also, another problem that we have here is when I adjust the amount control, it also sends that value there. We actually just want to select the value that's coming from the high pass frequency, high pass filter. So we can use another object in Max called a root. And what the root object does is you can give it an argument of a certain selector. In this case, the selector is going to be the number we want to root. So I say selector 2. And the way the root message works, or the root object works, is you can send a number of messages into it, and it will only output from this output here if the input matches that particular value. So let's hook this in to our message box here. You'll see if I adjust my amount control now, I don't get anything. But if I adjust this control here, I now get just the value of that control. And you'll notice it also removes the 2 from the front of it, which is quite useful. So basically it takes a message, there's that full message we're getting, 2 and then the number, and it removes the first bit of that when it sees a particular message and then sends anything that comes after that. So we can now hook that into our prepend message, and there we have this value that we can display on our control. So you might be picking up, if you're kind of newish to Max, that essentially all we're doing in Max and the way to kind of learn how Max works is you really are just learning about all these different objects. In the same way as in like music production, you learn about different effects and what they do, and then you can integrate them into your workflow. in Max, you learn about different objects, what they do, how they process data or audio, and then you can start to integrate them into how you build. So again, just to reiterate that building plugin wrappers is a great way to get started because you can work with these sort of relatively simple objects and sort of figure out how they work and what they do without having to worry about complex audio processing. So if you do want to go further down the line into building more advanced Max devices, you've got a lot of these kind of really handy, useful things like prepend and set and root. You already know what those do. So that's pretty handy. Cool. So that is the, I'll delete that comment for now. That is this control sorted. So we've got the value that we're going to see there. We're going to define the interface for this in a little bit. Let's add our last control though, which is going to be this mono control. For this, we actually want a switch because basically it's either on or off. So I'm going to go live.text. Live.text, just again, another object that you can learn is a user interface button or toggle. And this is basically just a button that you can toggle to be on or off. And I can hook that into this. In this case, I could actually connect, I don't actually want to connect the right outlet. You'll see that with the live.text, unlike these controls here where it says parameter raw value, this says item symbol. This over here says item index. The way that a button works is the item index is either 0 or 1. So 1 if it's on, 0 if it's off. Because this controls a button, I don't need anything in between. Just a 0 or a 1 is actually fine for me here. So if I hook that up to this prepend mono, it's going to send a 0 or a 1 and it's on, 0 and it's off. So that's super simple. I can configure some stuff about this, this particular parameter. Maybe I'll call this mono check. Mono check will be the long name, and then maybe mono is the short name. With buttons, you have slightly different ranges here. With a button, you have basically two values, either your on and your off value. And what can be, well, in this case, we'll set it to off and on. And it's just basically two words with a space in between them, off and on. Then if you scroll down a bit further, you also have these labels. And these are what show up on the parameter itself. So automation labels is what's going to show up in the automation chooser. These labels are what's going to show up on the control itself. And maybe what we'll do is we actually just set these to both say mono, because we know, so now we can see without having to add a label to this control, we know this is a mono switch, and obviously now it's on, now it's off. So instead of having it as A and B and having to add a separate label, we can just add the label in the switch itself. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do is actually create some kind of interface for this. In Max, if I save this now, which actually generally a good idea to sort of save right off the bat, I'm just going to call this wider wrapper and just kind of save as you go, because I would have lost everything if I had done something funny there. Always a good idea to save as you're going. If I save this patch now and I were to go over to Ableton, what you'll notice is that I've just got this kind of blank view here. Actually, if I save it again, now that I've moved these parameters up, notice how you can see in Ableton, I can see the insides of this device. So objects or devices in Max have two kind of views. You have the patcher view, which is where we're kind of editing things. And then you have what's known as presentation view, which is what you're going to see inside of Ableton. We need to actually enable presentation view for a patcher. To do that, we make sure we have nothing in the patcher selected. So just click in a blank space, go up to the patcher inspector at the top here. So if you click on, if nothing's selected, you can click on this icon here, and that brings up the inspector for the whole patcher. And we can scroll down and say open in presentation. Now, if I save this and I go back over to live, you'll see I haven't got the big sort of full width that I had before. I've just got this small little panel here. And that's because I haven't actually added anything to my presentation. We first need to tell Max, what do we actually want to see in our interface? Because at the moment, we've just got all of this. We don't want to see all of it. So what we do is we just select the objects that we want to add to our presentation. You right click on them and say add to presentation. They'll get highlighted in red. Then we can click this icon on the bottom here to go into presentation mode. And you'll see that hides all the kind of guts of our patch and just shows us the things that are in our presentation. Now we can kind of move these around, put stuff where we want, and save. So hop back over. Now you can see we're starting to have a bit of a device. So let's just kind of configure this a little bit. We can maybe select this text here. We'll say text justification. We'll make that centered. So it's going to sit there. In fact, what we can do is with these controls, maybe we want to make them a little bigger. If I select this control and go all the way up to the top here, in this appearance panel, you have this thing called display style. You can show the control in different ways. You can have tiny, you can have a panel. I quite like this large control. I'm going to set that for both of these. I'm going to set it to large. And just kind of configure this device. We can use the arrow keys to sort of move things around. Okay, so you would have noticed I've left a big blank space over here. That's because we're going to add this kind of nice little icon at the top here, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. But you can see I'm starting to get my patch is working here. But before we go any further, let's just actually make sure that the patch is working. So the first thing we want to do is we want to lock the patch. That's down in the bottom left here. Command or Control plus E is the shortcut. We can then save it and quit the patch. Before we do that, though, Max has this thing called freezing. If you're familiar with collect all and save in Ableton, freezing is kind of the last step that you do before you save a Max patch. And essentially what that does is if we've used any external bits, any images, anything that's come from outside of Max, it saves them in the patch. In this case, we haven't used any images, but it's good to get into the habit of before you save your patch, just freeze it. There's no kind of harm in freezing it. And then I'll save it and quit. So let's actually just check that this is working. So we hear our first audio for the first time in this. Very nice. Wide. Okay. And I can check that it's working in mono. So, boom, that's working. Really is as simple as that to build a wrapper. But so we're going to add this kind of little interface element to the patch. So if we go back over to Max, in order to add graphics to your Max patch, there's a number of different ways that you can do it. You can add PNG and JPEG images if you want, but I recommend using SVG images. So SVG is a particular kind of graphic file called a scalable vector graphic. The reason we're going to use these is because you can do things like change the color inside the Max patch so it can follow along with your live theme. You can even sort of rescale the plugin without adding pixelation. So if you use just like a regular image, if you scale the plugin up and down, it'll pixelate. So SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. It's just generally a better idea to work with these SVG files. You can create these using lots of different image editing applications, or you can use a website like the Noun Project. Thenounproject.com is this library of icons, essentially, and you can download them in SVG formats. A lot of these are freely available. Sometimes you have to attribute them. But if you're not a designer, you can find tons of cool icons and things to add to your plugins here, and that'll just give you an SVG file. Now, there's a number of different ways you can add SVGs into Max. One way is you can just drag and drop it straight into Max, and it adds that image, which is pretty cool. This creates something called an FPIC. An FPIC is just a picture, just a way of adding an image to Max. Another way, and what I think is a better way of adding images to Max, is we're actually going to use our live.text object again. So one of the things that's kind of cool about the live.text object is if you scroll all the way down, you'll see there's a section here that says use pictures. You can actually use images in place of the labels on the button. So if I say use pictures, it's going to expect two file paths. So I can't actually just drop the image in there. I need to get the actual file path of this image. On Mac, you can actually press Command Alt and C, copies the file path. But an easy way to sort of find the file path is if you actually just drag it into Max as an FPIC, the file path will show up here in the image file in the inspector. So I can just double click on that and Command C to copy that file path. Now, if I go back over to this live.txt, I'm just going to paste that file path in. I'm actually going to paste it in twice, so space and then twice, because you can have a different image for the on and off state of the button. So you can see I can drag that to be nice and big, and I've got the same image for on and off in this case. But sometimes you might want to have a different image. You'll see we're going to add an icon just now that's going to have a different image. The benefit of this is I can now go in and actually customize the way that this looks. With an fpic, it's going to just look how the SVG looks. If it's yellow, it's going to be yellow. With a live.txt object, and with any of the live interface objects, you can customize how they look by going into the inspector into this colors section. So I can customize any of these. I can go to some mount control and I can change that dial color to be something different. What I can do with this live.txt object is I'm actually going to make most of the object transparent. I want to hide that background because I just want to see this icon. I'll leave the background color on. We'll turn off this. Basically just going into these, changing them to fixed and setting that fixed amount of the opacity to 0. So I'm just making it transparent. Oh, sorry. There's actually one thing I need to do before this is if I scroll back down to the use pictures, I need to enable this remap SVG colors option. And what that's going to do, so I've actually made it transparent, is it's going to make the actual SVG image follow the colors that we set in there. So now that I've remapped that, you'll see I probably made, I think it's the text color, I'd made it transparent. There we go. If I bring it back and make that black, I'm actually just going to switch it to dynamic, and I'll explain what that does in a moment. So I want the text color off and the text color on. Everything else I'm going to leave as transparent. So this is all transparent. This we can make transparent, and this we can make transparent. So effectively here, I have a button. I can click it. I can't see it changing. It's changing between the two states. If I were to just attach a message box to it, you can see it's sending a 0 and a 1. But for this particular interface element, I just want to have it be one color. Or maybe actually, I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a color for it when it's off. I'm going to set it to be kind of a gray color. Now, there's two ways that I can set colors for objects in Max. You can either set a fixed color, where I can set it to be, let's just toggle this to be off, a fixed color. Or you can use what are called dynamic colors. And generally, I recommend always using dynamic colors. The reason for this is dynamic colors follow the colors of your live theme. So you'll see when I go to dynamic colors and I click this little drop down, I have a bunch of options to choose from. These are all kind of preset colors that come from your live theme. And why this is really important is if you build a device and you use certain colors, if you change your live theme, you probably want those colors to change with it so that one, it's going to match with your theme, but two, maybe let's say you build the device with a dark theme, so you make it have kind of a light background. If you suddenly change to a light theme, that light background might not be so visible. So it's really important that you use these dynamic colors so that it follows along with Live's theme. So actually, I want to set these to be LCD shape. So sorry, that's the off. I'm going to set the off to be, let's set it to LCD text icon inactive. So it's going to be off. And then the on color, I'm going to set to be LCD shape variant, this kind of blue color. So when it's on, it's sort of blue. When it's off, it's kind of gray. Now, what we want to do is we want to add this to the presentation, go into our presentation mode. And I know I'm not using the kind of wider logo. I wanted to just do something slightly different for this. Just use this little graphic. I'm going to drop this up here. Now, if you remember in the device over in Live, I've got this kind of black background here. In Max, you have an object. You can add objects while you're in the presentation view. If I press N, you have an object called panel. Panel is just a blank panel that we can use for creating areas of color. And again, I'm going to set this color to, let's use LCD background, this kind of black. At the moment, this panel's in front of everything. I can right click on it and say send to back. And I can scale that to just be behind this here. What I'm actually going to do is just drag this up a bit so I can see the interface in Live. And I'll save, and you'll see that is starting to appear in my patch. I can move that, it'll kind of snap. Let's just adjust these. I'm going to be very kind of rough with the layout. What you can also do while you're building your patch is you can enable a live preview. This icon over here, very confusingly, it says preview is on, but you can see the device is kind of grayed out. If you actually disable that, you can see kind of what the device looks like in live, which is pretty handy. You can even go over and interact with it in live directly while you're building it, which is quite handy. So that's just this button over here that you can toggle on and off. And you can use that to sort of move some things around. You always have to save to update the view. So I'm just moving things and saving just to kind of adapt. And what you'll notice is that the device's width, if I move these all the way over to the right, adapts based on the number of controls that are in there. But it always kind of leaves this sort of patch on the side here. One thing we can do is we can set a fixed width for our devices in Macs. Again, if I go over to the patcher inspector and I scroll down to this fixed initial window location, this third value is the width of the device. If I set this to 10 and I save, so there's actually a minimum width that you can have for Macs devices, so it doesn't get smaller than that. But you can see in the patcher here, it's set that to a very small width. But if I set this to 100, maybe let's try, you've kind of got to just experiment, 110. Maybe it's 104. There we go. That looks pretty good. Maybe it's 105. You can see that that now sets this device to a fixed width that kind of wraps around the device there. Maybe we even do something else, like I'm going to add a panel, and this panel I'm going to set to be, let's use it like, there's this LCD background text. Is that the one I'm after? No, actually, I don't want that one. Yeah, that'll work. This kind of light gray, I'm going to stick that behind here, send to back. That's going to sit behind these controls to add like an additional little display panel. So actually, that's not the one I want. Let's try a different one. Let's use, what's the one I'm looking for? LED background's a bit dark. So sometimes it takes a bit of experimenting to just find one that's going to work. You could try like Spectrum Grid. That looks kind of cool. That's a nice sort of background there. And we could go in and refine these, adjust parameters, et cetera, et cetera. But we've kind of mostly finished the interface of our device. There's one more thing that we need to add, and that is we want to have this button that we added open the actual plugin window. So these objects, just kind of any objects that you add while you're in the presentation, just sort of land in a random place. I just move those out the way. Can make this a bit smaller. In order to have the plugin window pop open, so this, someone asked about this sort of spanner that opens the plugin window. You can do that programmatically. Again, that's something you can find out by going over to the reference. And if you scroll all the way down, or move your eyes all the way down, you can see that the message open says open the plugin edit window. So if I say message open, and I connect this in to this patch here. So again, you can see I pressed M for creating a message box. So in addition to being able to sort of monitor signals, message boxes are useful for sending particular kinds of messages. Now, if I click that, it opens that plugin window. I can hook this particular button into that open control. And I want to actually set it to the left inlet here. You can see in a message box, if I hover over the left, it says the left one triggers the message. So now when I press that, opens the plugin window. I could do something fancy here where like maybe gray closes it and blue is open. But just for simplicity's sake now, I'm just going to set them both to be blue because I want to kind of move on and look at some other things. Because we can always obviously just close the plugin window from here. So if I close this down, freeze it, lock it, and quit Macs, I now have a wrapper that I can open up and I can interact with. Unfortunately, the way Macs or the way Live works is if you open this up, if you click here, it hides the plugin window, but you can see it is obviously affecting the plugin, 6161. The one thing to pay attention to, though, is at the moment, you can set this up. It's a bit more advanced, but control is not bidirectional. So if I make an adjustment in the plugin, it's not going to make an adjustment in Macs. You can set that up, but to be honest, the whole point is to have this custom interface in Max. So it's not kind of worth all the extra effort. And I'm not gonna go through how you sort of set that up today. But just before we move on to the next thing that we'll build, if I head over to my website, you may or may not already be familiar. On my website, if you head to the experiments page, so Ableton Tools and Experiments, you can download here all of these wrappers that I've made, including the wider wrapper. And I did actually add bidirectionality to this particular wrapper. So if you want to see how to implement that, you can download this and open up the Max patch and dive inside and sort of see some additional stuff that's going on in there. Just to show you, if I open that up, you can see there's a whole bunch of extra things that I've added in here. There's parameters going into these controls that give it sort of bidirectionality, so that when I adjust I've got to unfreeze it to edit it. When I adjust the parameter here, notice how it adjusts the amount control as well. So you can add that to the plugin. It's just a little bit more advanced. So I'm not going to get into that now, but you can go in and check out how that is all working. So let me just see if there's any other questions. And then I wanted to go through and build another example just to walk through that process again. And we'll go through it a lot more sort of quickly. We're going to build this Macity plugin here. But let's just quickly see if we've got any questions. Okay, excellent question. When you make a wrapper, do all the functioning parameters show up on push? I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to mention that and I totally forgot. So in order to add push compatibility to a device, you need to add an object to your patch. So if I open up the patch, called live.banks. And so you don't need to patch this into anything. You just need to literally add it into your patch. And then if you either lock your patch or just hold Command and double click on it, it opens up this parameter window. And here is where you can add banks to push. So you can name the bank. So maybe it's called wider. And then any parameters that you have visible in your patch will show up here. And you can add them, and then those will then show up on push. So you just need to add this live.banks object. And then if you save and close your patch and reload it, they should show up if you have the push connected. Yeah, you'll see it's always a good idea to sort of name your objects. I'm getting this live.text, which is this one over here because I didn't give it a name. What you can actually do if you've got objects in your interface that are just purely graphical, if you select that object, go to the inspector, scroll all the way down to the bottom, there's this parameter visibility option. By default, it's going to be on automated and stored. If you set that to hidden, then that parameter is not going to show up in live for things like automation. It's not going to show up for visibility on the push because obviously we don't want to have that visible. Maybe you want to have a control to open and close the plugin window, so you would have it visible in that case. But in this case, we're going to change the parameter visibility to hidden. So automated and stored means it's going to show up and you can automate it. Stored only means it's going to save the value of that parameter. So you generally want to have it on stored only, so it's going to save values when you save your patch at the very least. So if you don't want it automated but just stored, you can have it on there. And then automated and stored means you can also automate that parameter. So that's how you add push functionality. Does using wrappers increase or decrease CPU load relative to the original VST plugin? So it increases the CPU load slightly. The reason for that is because it's still effectively running the plugin in the background, but it's now running additional bits of Max code. In an instance like this is incredibly small amounts of code, so it doesn't add a lot of processing. If you had kind of a lot of things going on, it might add a little bit more processing, but it's kind of a trade-off. It's basically, do you want the kind of cool, nice custom interface and the push integration and all that for a little bit of extra CPU usage? But it is, I have tested it and it's like very marginal CPU usage. So that is just a trade-off. Cool. I'm going to soldier on. If there's any more kind of general questions, we can save them for the end as well. There will be some more time for more general questions. But let's go through that whole process again and build this Macity plugin. And I'm going to go through it relatively quickly, but just to sort of walk through all those steps so you can see them all. And we're actually going to add additional functionality to this. So this Macity plugin is a kind of distortion. So if I play these drums, I'll just do it on the plugin. It really kind of crunches the drums there. It's kind of a nice distortion, but it gets really loud really quickly. It's got an output pad, but it'd be really nice if as you turned the input up, the output went down. So one of the reasons you might want to wrap a Max device is that you can set up that kind of functionality. So we're going to build this McAtee wrapper. So here's the wrapper. And we're going to add in this custom functionality where I can link the gain to the output. You'll see there as I turn the gain up, if it's linked, the output goes down. So running the same plugin, but it just automatically compensates for the gain. So let's look at how we might build that. So again, just going to load up a blank Max audio effect because we're going to be building an audio effect and open that up. And I'm just going to go straight to the plugins window. I'm going to use audio units this time because the Air Windows plugins don't have VST 3s. And I'm going to find McAtee. I could just filter McAtee and drag that in. Here's this plugin over here. And patch that straight in to the plug in and plug out. So let's do this into the ins and the outs. Oh, get that there. Plug in, plug out. Awesome. Now we need to add let's add our controls first. I'm going to go live.dial. So we're going to have, if I look at the interface that we have here, we're going to have a dial for the gain, and then we can actually have another interface element for the output. We'll have something smaller. So I'm going to turn this immediately into a large dial, open the inspector, go into a large dial. We'll say gain, gain, gain. In this case, the actual value is going to be from 0 to 1. All these Air Windows plugins just go from 0 to 1. We'll set the initial value to 0, and we'll set the unit style to floating point because we want it to display numbers between 0 and 1. So there's our gain control. For the output pad, I'm going to use live.numbox. So this is another kind of interface object that you can use, and this is just a number box. So it looks like this. Functions in the same way as a dial in that it sends values, but it just looks like a number box. So this is going to be output, output, output. Again, the range is going to be 0 to 1. We'll initial it to 1 in this case, and we'll set it to float. Cool. So very quick configuration of those controls. Then we need to do our good old friend prepend. Now, this is one of those instances where the control name has got a space between it. So we use the inverted commas. In trim, hook that up. Oh, in this case, because our control is actually going from 0 to 1, we could hook it into either one. But just out of sort of habit, I'm going to hook it into this raw parameter value and connect that. And then we need prepend out pad. And hook that in and hook that in there. And now that should work. Awesome. So actually we want the initial of this to be 0.1. So let's set that initial value to 0.1. Now when I lock the patch and double click, it sets it to 0.1. And that is also working as the out trim. Cool. So super, super simple wrapper to build. Took less than 2 minutes to put all that together. We want to go now to click to have nothing selected, go to the patcher inspector, open in presentation. We're going to right click and add to presentation. We click to go into the presentation mode, and we'll just sort of stick these in here. If we wanted to add this kind of cool McAtee graphic, I'll drop that in, but I'm going to add a live.text again. Actually, in this case, I'm just going to, I'll go with live.text. I could leave it as an SVG because I'm not going to have it as a button, But remember, I want this to follow along with my theme. So you'll see actually, just to show this now, if I go back over to live with this wider wrapper that I've made, if I go into my preferences and I change the theme, notice how everything in that device follows along and updates with my theme, which is quite nice because I use those dynamic colors. So if you want to have that kind of functionality, you need to use this live.txt. And I'm going to just grab that file path. And I'm going to say use pictures, paste it in there twice. I want it for both. And remap SVG colors. Let's kind of scale that up and get rid of that there. And then again, I'm just going to set all of these to fixed and turn their opacity all the way down to make them invisible. The text color, I'm going to set this so it's going to be dynamic. In this case, I want it to be this LCD text icon and make that yellow. The more you kind of use these things, the more you get to know like which colors kind of relate to which sort of parameters in live. We're going to look at some of that a little bit later on, but I'll add that in. I'll add a panel and I'll make it an LCD background, send to back, send it behind this. And in fact, with a lot of objects, so for example, this now, if I select this live numbox, if you go all the way to the top, certain objects, you saw how we had these different display styles for the gain control. I've made this nice big gain control. The live numbox actually has a display style. It's got a number of different options here, but one of them is called LCD. And LCD gives you this style that goes against this kind of black background quite nicely. So I'm also going to just center that text. And if I save that, this is going to be McAtee. You can sort of adjust things in the device, maybe set a device width 100. Maybe we'll set it to be 100 and we'll just kind of make this a bit wider and then line this all up into the middle. You can also, if you select objects like this, you can right click and say align center, just snaps everything to the middle for you. So there we go. We've got our basic wrapper. You can see it doesn't take long in this case with a sort of very simple device to build a kind of basic wrapper. So now how are we going to scale this parameter? Basically what we want to do is we want to say as this control is going up, the output pad is going to go down. So actually the out pad I think defaults to 1. Let me just double check that in McAtee. If I reload this plugin. So you can always go back to the plugin itself to just check the defaults. Yeah, so actually it defaults to an initial of 1. So if I go over to this Max device, actually I want to set this to be, okay, initial value 1. We had that set there. So basically what I want is, as I turn this gain control up, I want this control to go down. There's kind of a number of different ways that we could do this. Probably a really easy way to do it is we could actually just use that scale object. And if I type scale, say 0 to 1, I can just flip that around and say 1 to 0. And so I can take this output, and now we should see that as I scale, it just does that in the opposite direction. We could even actually do it because this gain control starts at 0.1. Maybe we actually just scale it where we say 0.1 to 1, and that's going to go from 1 to maybe 0.1. That's pretty handy. And we should be able to just plug that into this control. And look at that. So when one goes up, the other goes down. That's pretty handy. We can still adjust this, but you'll see, obviously, when we make that adjustment, it jumps back to where it was. So I can adjust it there, but then as soon as I adjust this, because the scaling kicks in, it's going to kind of manually scale it. So this kind of might be all that we want. If we wanted to just always kind of have that sort of following behavior, and then maybe we go in and we adjust the trim. But if you remember in this one here, I had this option to kind of lock and unlock it so that you can toggle that behavior on and off so that it does follow or it doesn't follow the gain control. So let's maybe add that section to our patch. We're going to add another object. I'm going to add a live.text because we want to have a little toggle, basically. And again, I'm going to use some icons for that. I'll use these. Well, I'll come back to and add those just now, just because it takes a bit of time to add. Let's just work with just this for now and get the basic kind of patch set up. I'll just say, yeah, I'll leave it as A and B for now. What we want to do is we want to use what's called a gate in Max. So a gate says pass input to an outlet. And we can say how many outlets do we want to have. We actually just want sort of one outlet. So we're going to leave it just as, you don't even have to add an argument. So if you just wanted the one outlet, you can just leave that off. So there's the gate. And what a gate does is it basically just has an input here where it says 0 closes the gate, non-zero opens the gate. So we know that this toggle sends a 0 and a 1. So we can send that in there to open and close the gate. And then this here is our incoming gated message. So we want to take this and just stick it on the other side of the gate and hook that in there. Now, so if the gate's closed, nothing happens. If I open the gate, now that works. And I can unlink it and make that adjustment. So this is a really simple version of it. There's a lot more that we could add to make this patch a bit more complicated. We could have this kind of scale. You'll notice now that obviously if it's if I unlock it so that it sends the value, this value jumps very quickly. We could add some kind of scaling in there, but it's a little bit more advanced. Again, what I will let you do is this McAtee patch is also actually, I lie. It's not in this Air Windows package yet, but I'm going to be releasing an update to this soon, which will have it in. And then you can dive in and look at that McAtee patch and see how to add some more complexity to it. But I wanted to show you this just as an example of a really simple way, if we add this to the presentation, a really simple way of adding additional functionality to a plugin that maybe wasn't there before. Let's go over just adding in an SVG icon just one more time. In fact, in this case, I want to have two different ones. I want to have the linked and unlinked. So I want unlinked to be for when it's off and linked to be for when it's on. So I'll copy the file path of the unlinked. I'll select that and say use pictures. And I'm going to paste that into the first half here. So that's the first one. You can see the second one still is none. So if I remove all these colors, actually, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy paste this one because I've done what don't need to remove all those colors again. And let's just copy that. And paste that in, and then none for the second one. So now I've got unlinked and then blank. And then if I copy the location for the linked one, and I'll add that in the second half here, I'll just replace that second none. Now I have a linked and I have an unlinked. I can get rid of those. I can move that in there. You can press Command plus or minus to zoom in if you want to get a bit more detailed or sort of smaller. Add that over there. Save that patch. And now if I freeze. So this is a good point to mention. I mentioned just freezing out of habit earlier on. This is point where we actually do need to freeze because we've added these external image files. If you want to save those image files into the Mac's device, so if you want to share it to somebody else and those image files are still there, or if maybe you move the image files or you want to move it to a different computer, you do need to freeze the device, and then that saves those image files into the Mac's device so you can move it around and it'll always have those images. I can quit this, and now we should have a functioning. Turn these off. Okay. Link on. I know why my link is not working. It's because I copied the image. So often there's some kind of troubleshooting in Macs that you might run into. That was because I copied this image here, and so I had deleted the one that I had patched into my gate. So that should now work. Freeze it, save it. Automatically compensating my gain. Again, there's a lot more kind of detail that we can add to this, other things that we could add to add more complexity, but that's just a very basic example. So another time to just sort of pause and see if there's any questions. And then what we can do is we can dive into some more kind of edge case things and look at some other things to consider when building these plugins that don't always come up, but that might come up and are good to be aware of, as well as looking at some other kind of interface elements that you can use in your wrappers or just in Macs in general. Can the order of the VST parameters be changed if you're not using push and using other controllers with a general mapping script? Yes, they can. So in a patch, if I go into a Max patch, and this is just a general Max thing. This isn't specific to the plugins. If you go to View and then Parameters, this is a really handy window because it shows you all the parameters that are visible in your plugin or in your Max device. And you can just kind of quickly rename things from here, which is pretty handy. You can change the range, etc. But you've got this thing over here, which is called the order. By default, all of these are going to be set to 0. You can also change these in the inspector. So if I select an object, order is over here, so order 0. But I find it's much easier to just do in the parameter window. You can set an order for these, and that will be the order that they appear in what the automation chooses in live. It's sort of the default order when you do, like if you have like an auto mapping controller. So you just go into this parameters window and set the order. You can also do things like change the visibility of the parameters here. So it's a very, very handy window. Cool. I'm assuming it's possible to create one wrapper that uses 2 plugins at the same time. So yes, that's another really kind of cool benefit of wrappers, and one that I actually was going to show you is one of the other things that you can do with wrappers is kind of create a combo plugin if you want. So there's this really cool plate reverb that Air Windows makes, but there's actually 4 different models, A, B, C, and D, and they're all separate plugins. But actually, I just wanted to have them all as one easy plugin that I can switch between using this little toggle here. And so, yes, you can do that. You can have multiple VST objects which have different VST plugins inside of the same patch. You will obviously need to add some additional routing to decide which one is on and off. You can see I've got this routing here where this model control is turning different ones on and off. And then this object, the selector, routes their audio output. So this is a little bit more complicated. But yes, that is all possible. While we're here, a couple of things to point out which are unique to this patch is you'll notice that I've got this thing that says S -- mode select and then R -- mode select. Generally, when you're connecting objects in Macs, you're using patch cables to connect to inlets and outlets. Depending on your patch, things can get pretty messy where you've got like lots of cables running. You can actually send messages wirelessly using objects called send and receive. So send is one, and I'll tell you why it's orange in a moment, and receive is another. You actually need to give these names. So this would be send test, because Max needs to know which send object sends to which receive object. Now, if I were to send a message, I'll just use this low cut. If I send it into one send object, you can see it comes out the receive object. So it's just a way to send messages wirelessly, and that can just kind of tidy up your patches. The thing that's really important, though, is these send objects can actually send messages between patches, between max patches. So if I had multiple max patches loaded and I had send and receive objects in them that were called test, if I sent a control to this send value, it would send it off to all the other max patches that have that same thing. And then you're going to get controls adjusting all over the place, which is probably not what you want. So what you can do when you name your send objects, send and receive objects, is if you add 3 dashes before the name, so you'll see there's all these 3 dashes, every time that patch gets loaded, Max adds a random number there. So it'll be 176 test, and then it'll match it with the receive objects, so that each different Max device will have its own send and receive objects so they don't get mixed up between them. You can, of course, use that creatively where you can actually send messages between patches, and some people do use that to send messages across different Max devices, which is pretty cool. But that's just a general sort of Max tip there. So yes, you can have multiple plugins inside of one wrapper. I wanted to know more about selectors. My plugin has modes. It's saturated with different types, and I want to set that up to select the mode within the plugin. If there's no time to go over how that works. So if in this case, that doesn't actually matter too much, because where would be an example? Have I got an example here? So actually, this is going to be a good example, this little altar boy. One of the beauties of working with wrappers and not building the plugin yourself is the logic to switch between modes is actually just built into the plugin itself. So this is the little altar boy plugin. This particular control here, shift mode, there's different modes. But the plugin does all of that. So it's exactly the same as working with other parameters. So if you've got a plugin that maybe there's a toggle that switches between saturation, distortion, overdrive, etc., or maybe there's a drop-down menu, the way that that's going to show up in this VST interface is exactly the same. Whether it's a stepped menu, whether it's a continuous control, they all show up like this, and they all just expect values in the range of 0 to 1. And then it's just up to you to use different interface objects. So this, somebody asked the question about like an ABC object. So you have live text, live.text, which is just the A and the B. But then you also have live.tab, which is a multiple tab object. And so you can have a number of different tabs. So I can say 1, 2, 3, and it's based on how many items you have here. So if I say 4 and then banana, that's what shows up on this, and it sort of adapts there. So you can then switch between, so like here on this one, it switches between those different modes. You also have drop-down menus. So again, you can add multiple items to the menu and switch between that there. And that's going to work in the same way. It's all just going to go into this VST object and send values in the range of 0 to 1. Sometimes there's a bit of scaling that you might need to do, because bear in mind that like this drop-down menu, it's going to start at 0, then it's going to go 1, then it's going to go 2. So maybe you need to scale 0 to 4 to 0 to 1. And there's other kind of ways around it. But the plugin itself is going to do all of that for you. Obviously, there's ways to do that in Max as well if you're building your own custom plugins where you can switch between things. But that's, I think, for a different workshop. Okay, so there's no more questions, but we've got 15 minutes left. What I wanted to do just to kind of wrap up, first, let me just see if there's any more questions about the actual kind of functionality of building the wrappers. There are a couple sort of important things to cover in terms of extra little bits that you might run into. But then I also wanted to talk about the sort of interface aspect of things. But before I dive into that, are there any kind of last questions about actually building the device? Hopefully that's all sort of made sense. So I want to show you just a couple extra little things that are worth just being aware of when building plugin wrappers. The first is, I mentioned earlier, latency. So when you have plugins in live, if you hover over the plugin's title bar, so you can see I've got little altar boy, in this bottom bar at the top, it shows you the latency that plugin has. Little altar boy is a good example because it has a lot of latency. It's got 50 milliseconds of latency. When you're wrapping a plugin, if you don't tell it what the latency of the plugin is, Live can't automatically compensate that latency. So the way that Live handles this and keeps everything in time so that all your tracks are in time, even if certain plugins have latency, is it automatically compensates for that latency. It shifts things in time to be in time with one another. But in Max, you actually need to tell Max what the latency of the device is so it can report it correctly to Live. So what you need to do is inside the patch, in the patcher inspector. So again, with nothing selected, you can go up to the patcher inspector. You will see there is a setting over here for defined latency. And there I've set a number. That's going to be in milliseconds. So all you need to do when you are building a wrapper is load up the initial plugin and hover over it. And you can see, so like wider, latency is 0 samples. So there I don't actually need to add anything to wider. McAtee, latency is 0 samples. So I wouldn't need to add anything there. If I hover over a little plate, you can see it says the latency is 32 samples. So if I was building a little plate wrapper, I would need to go in and add that number 32 to the wrapper. So if I open this little plate wrapper and go into the patcher inspector, you'll see there I've defined the latency as 32. And so then Live can correctly adjust for that latency. So that's sort of one thing that's quite important to be aware of. The other thing I wanted to mention, we've already looked at how you can have multiple plugins inside of one, which is pretty handy. I guess the last thing that I just wanted to go through is just to kind of talk about the interface sort of broadly and discuss things that you can do within the interface. We definitely not going to have time to get to this. I'd hope maybe we would have time, but you can even add things to the interface like, if I play this, this is starting to get into a lot more advanced things. So we're not going to have time to get into that today, unfortunately. But obviously feel free to dig into these wrappers. But you'll see that there's lots of different kinds of controls that you can have. Obviously, dials are the most common ones. We've got toggles, which is a live.txt that we've seen. We've got things like these multi-select buttons that you have over here that you've seen as well, which you can use as interface objects. But if we open up, and let's go into one of these patches. Inside of Max, you can actually see all of the interface objects that are available by hovering over this area in the top. So there's two ways to create objects. You can either press N and type in the name of the object. And sort of one way to see it is to just type live dot. And then you can go through this list and you'll see all the different interface objects that are have live interfaces. So like live slider, live dot dial, we know. So that's one way. Or you can go to this here, and this lists all the interface objects that are available, and you can just drag and drop them in to add that object. So you've got like live.tab, live.arrows, button, dial we've seen, slider we've got. Live.line is actually just like a display thing. It's just a straight line. All the way up to, you can even get some kind of custom objects like this live.drop, lets you drop files in there, which is much sort of more advanced. But you can see you've got all these different kinds of interface objects that you can work with. These are all live dot objects. So these are objects that are specifically made to be interface elements inside of Max for Live. But Max itself actually has its own interface objects. And you can see some of those from these other menus. So for example, if I create a button that looks a little bit different, there's a toggle, there's a text button, a tab, a U button's like an invisible button. There's all these different things that I have here, even different kinds of sliders and knobs that you'll see don't look like what you're used to in Ableton. These are kind of Max native. So if you're using Max outside of Ableton, you can use these. Generally, it's not recommended to use these because there's a number of sort of extra things that these live controls have that make them just work better in live. Things like being recalled, automation, all that stuff just generally kind of works better. But you can be quite creative with some of these to use these objects in interesting ways inside of your patch. So an example of this, if you take a look at this little plate wrapper, inside of the little plate plugin, I wanted to kind of give it the vibe of the little plate where it's got this nice red ring around it and these other rings over here. I could probably have just used some kind of graphics there, but you'll see what I've done in this wrapper is these are actually, so you see this red and this white, if I select those, these are actually just Max dials. I can lock the patch. Actually, I can't interact with those because I turned them off. But this is just your regular dial, not live.dial. It's just a regular dial. And I've hidden the background and changed the indicator color. Oh, actually, it's changed the outline color to be something. And then you can do stuff like, where is it in here? Ignore click means that you're not going to be able to click on this object. So you can just use it as like an interesting kind of display object. So you can do interesting things with some of the other objects like that as well. Another interesting thing in this little plate is this object over here is actually a live.tab. Ignore click is on. So you can see it's this multiple toggle button, but I wanted to use that to create this cool kind of little thing that mirrors what's going on over here in the little plate to kind of give it the vibe. So you can use those interface elements in creative ways. And you'll see with a lot of these wrappers, you can add different colors to dials, and we've seen how to do that. That can add a lot of customization. So you can get pretty creative with them. This live.text, so for adding graphics, is also just like a really cool way of adding a bit of sort of spice to your plugins. Generally, what I'd recommend is looking at the built-in Ableton devices to get ideas of how things are laid out. So for example, you'll often see this sort of setup in devices where you've got like a kind of a black window up in the top here, maybe some controls below, a line that divides them, and control on the right. And then you've got like a tab that switches between different things. So this, like you could use a panel in the back, you can use a live.line to do that. Here's another example of you've got like a line dividing these different things with all these different interface objects. Sometimes you'll even notice like there's lots of different panels in devices. There's sort of slightly darker gray panels with these kind of light gray lines in between them. So that's kind of a way that you can look at for setting up your devices, or even kind of various combinations thereof. Like this has got this black panel, but then a kind of a gray panel there. There's a live.line dividing that. So take a look at the built-in live devices and any of the like Ableton-made Max devices for kind of good ways to think about how to make your interface. But it's also totally up to you. You can kind of completely customize these to look and feel however you want. You don't even have to use Ableton dials and colors and all that. You can go completely nuts with this if you want. So Um, cool. So I think that's everything that we needed to kind of cover. I know that was sort of a whirlwind tour of Macs if you were totally new to Macs. Fortunately, building wrappers is relatively simple as far as Macs devices go. So hopefully a lot of that has made sense